3 small coffins lay side by side in the morning frost, but the girls inside them weren't dead. The sound of scratching fingernails against pine wood echoed through Bramble Holler as the sun crept over the ridge, while the scent of wood smoke and something else, something wrong, drifted down from the Ashbourne cabin. This is the story of Essie, Bessie, and Dessie Ashbourne, triplets born into the mountains of West Virginia in 1836, whose silence spoke louder than any scream ever could. The Appalachian Mountains have always harbored secrets in their hollows and ridges, where communities grew so isolated that bloodlines tangled like mountain laurel, and justice answered to no courthouse, but the one carved from fear and tradition. Bramble Holler was no different. A settlement of maybe 40 souls scattered across the mountainside, connected by deer paths and a shared understanding that some things were better left unspoken. The Ashbourne family lived at the settlement's heart, in a cabin that had sheltered 3 generations of mountain folk who minded their own business and expected others to do the same. Mortimer Ashbourne worked the hillside like his father before him, coaxing corn and beans from soil that seemed more rock than earth. His wife Helena Bramblecroft Ashbourne came from good mountain stock, a woman who could birth a calf, cure a ham, and sing the old ballads that kept the mountain spirits at bay. When Helena's time came in the bitter winter of 1836, the midwife Marcella Westley climbed through knee-deep snow to attend the birth, expecting 1 child, maybe 2, if the Lord saw fit to bless the Ashbournes with twins. Nobody expected 3. The triplets arrived during the longest night of the year, when the mountain wind howled like something hungry and the cabin's single window rattled in its frame. Marcella later told folks that she delivered hundreds of babies in her 40 years of midwifery, but she'd never seen newborns who didn't cry. Not once. Essie came first, then Bessie, then Dessie, 3 identical girls with dark hair and darker eyes, who stared at the world with an unsettling intensity that made grown men uncomfortable. "They watch everything," Marcella whispered to her husband that night, her hand still shaking as she recounted the birth. "Like they're taking notes." The girls grew in perfect synchronization, reaching every milestone on the same day, speaking their first words in unison, taking their first steps as if choreographed by some invisible force. But while most children babbled and laughed and filled their homes with noise, the Ashbourne triplets maintained an eerie quiet that settled over the cabin like fog over a graveyard. They communicated through glances and gestures, completing each other's thoughts before those thoughts could become words. Neighbors noticed. Phineas Coldbrook, whose property bordered the Ashbourne land, mentioned to his wife that he'd seen the 3 girls standing perfectly still at the edge of the woods, watching him work his fields with expressions too old for their faces. "Made my skin crawl," he admitted over supper. "Like they were studying me for some purpose I wouldn't care to know." The girls aged, but the silence persisted. When Essie, Bessie, and Dessie turned 7, the settlement's traveling preacher, Josiah Thornvale, arrived for his monthly visit to find the children sitting in the front pew of the makeshift church, hands folded, eyes fixed on him with an intensity that made his prepared sermon stick in his throat. After the service, he pulled Mortimer aside. "Those girls of yours," Thornvale said, mopping sweat from his forehead despite the cool mountain air, "they haven't blinked once in the past hour." Mortimer shrugged, the way mountain men do when pressed about family matters. "They're just quiet children, preacher. Ain't no law against that." But there were other things, small things that folks noticed but didn't discuss. The way mountain communities handle uncomfortable truths. Animals went missing. First chickens, then larger livestock. Pets refused to approach the Ashbourne property. Children from neighboring families developed sudden fevers after playing near the triplets, fevers that broke as quickly as they came, but left the young ones changed, more cautious, as if they'd learned something they couldn't quite remember. The triplets themselves seemed untouched by childhood's typical afflictions. They never caught the mountain fever that swept through the holler every few years. They never scraped their knees or caught their fingers in doors. They never seemed to feel cold, even when frost painted the cabin windows and other children huddled near the fire. By the time they reached their 15th year, the silence had evolved into something more deliberate, more purposeful. The girls had grown tall and lean, moving with a grace that seemed almost supernatural. They dressed identically, spoke in unison when they spoke at all, and shared a knowledge that excluded everyone else in the settlement, including their own parents. Helena Ashbourne aged rapidly during those years, her hair going gray, her hands developing a tremor that she tried to hide during Sunday services. Mortimer took to drinking corn whiskey in quantities that concerned his neighbors, though none dared comment directly. The couple had tried for more children after the triplets, but Helena miscarried 3 times in succession, each loss leaving her more hollow-eyed and withdrawn. The mountain itself seemed to respond to the girls' presence. Gardens near the Ashbourne property produced stunted vegetables that tasted of ash. Wells that had run clear for generations began yielding water with a metallic tang that made livestock refuse to drink. The old-timers muttered about curses and mountain spirits, but these were modern times, 1854, and such talk belonged to their grandparents' generation. 3 girls couldn't be responsible for the holler's growing unease. Could they? What happens when silence becomes a weapon, and 3 sisters decide that 18 years of watching is enough? The answer would come with a harvest moon, when Bramble Holler learned that some hungers can only be satisfied with the taste of betrayal, and that blood runs thickest when it's spilled by family hands. But before we witness how the Ashbourne triplets earned their place in the darkest corners of Appalachian folklore, take a moment to let us know where you're watching from and what time it is in your corner of the world. These stories connect us across distance and time, reminding us that darkness finds us wherever we are. If this tale of mountain secrets and sisterly silence has caught your attention, hit that like button and subscribe, because the true horror of Essie, Bessie, and Dessie Ashbourne is just beginning to unfold. The morning Phineas Coldbrook found his prize bull with its throat opened in a perfect line. The blood had been drained so completely that the grass beneath the carcass remained green. The scent of copper pennies hung in the dawn air, while frost crunched under his boots as he circled the animal, searching for tracks that simply weren't there. This marked the beginning of Bramble Holler's descent into a darkness that would reshape how mountain folk understood the nature of evil itself. The incident occurred on October 15th, 1853, just 3 weeks after the Ashbourne triplets had celebrated their 17th birthday in their characteristic silence. Phineas had owned that Hereford bull for 6 years, a massive beast named Caesar that had sired half the calves in the holler and had never shown fear of man or animal. Yet something had approached Caesar in the pre-dawn darkness, something the bull had allowed close enough to draw a blade across his neck with surgical precision. Whoever done this knew exactly what they were about, Phineas told his neighbor, studying the wound. This ain't the work of wildcats or wolves. This is butcher's work. But mountain butchers left tracks. Mountain butchers took meat. Whatever had killed Caesar had taken nothing but blood, leaving nearly 800 pounds of prime beef to rot in the morning sun. The discovery sent ripples of unease through the settlement. Livestock meant survival in Bramble Holler, where winter could stretch from November through April, and the nearest town lay 2 days' hard travel through mountain passes that became impassable when the snows came. Losing an animal to predators was part of mountain life, but this felt different, deliberate, wasteful, almost ceremonial in its precision. Marcella Wesley, the midwife who had delivered the Ashbourne triplets 17 years earlier, found herself remembering details she'd tried to forget. The way the newborns had emerged without crying. The strange birthmark each girl bore on her left shoulder, 3 interlocking circles that looked almost like symbols carved into flesh. The fact that Helena Ashbourne had bled far less during the triple birth than most women bled, delivering a single child. Blood calls to blood, Marcella's grandmother had always said, back when such sayings carried weight in the mountains. 2 days after Caesar's death, the widow Morrison's chickens were found arranged in a perfect circle in her yard, each bird intact but drained of life, their eyes clouded white as winter frost. The widow, a stern woman who had raised 8 children and buried 2 husbands, packed her belongings and moved in with her sister down in the valley that very afternoon. Something stirring in these mountains, she told anyone who would listen. Something that's been sleeping too long. The Ashbourne triplets attended Caesar's impromptu funeral, if such a term could be applied to the hasty burial. Phineas gave the bull before the meat spoiled completely. The girls stood at the edge of the gathering, identical in their dark dresses and darker stares, watching as Phineas and 2 other men struggled to drag the massive carcass into a hastily dug pit. Essie smiled during the burial. Just once, just for a moment, but Josiah Thornvale caught at a slight upturn of lips that held no warmth, no humor, only a satisfaction that made the preacher's skin crawl. When he looked again, the expression had vanished, leaving only the familiar blank stare that had unsettled him for years. That evening, as families gathered around their hearth fires and checked their door latches twice before bed, the sound of singing drifted down from the Ashbourne cabin. 3 voices in perfect harmony, carrying a melody none of the old-timers recognized, but all of them felt in their bones. A tune that seemed to seep into the mountain itself, making the trees creak and the nightbirds fall silent. Blood remembers everything. Helena Ashbourne had been visiting her sister in the next holler when Caesar died, a fact she mentioned repeatedly to anyone who would listen. Mortimer had been checking his trap lines in the high country, a journey that would have taken him away from the settlement for 3 days. The alibi seemed solid, unshakable, but alibis meant nothing when the accused could be in 2 places at once. Old-timers began recounting stories their grandparents had whispered about mountain witches and blood curses, tales dismissed as superstition during the daylight hours, but given new credence when darkness fell and the singing echoed through the holler. The Cherokee had abandoned these mountains decades earlier, but their warnings about certain places, certain bloodlines, certain hungers that grew too strong to contain suddenly seemed less like folklore and more like prophecy. Dr. Edmund Fairfax, who traveled the mountain circuit treating ailments that local remedies couldn't touch, arrived in Bramble Holler during the 3rd week of October to find a community gripped by fear it couldn't name. Patients described dreams of 3 figures standing at the foot of their beds, watching, waiting. Children developed night terrors that left them screaming about the sisters who don't blink. Nursing mothers complained that their milk had turned thin and bitter. Mass hysteria, Dr. Fairfax wrote in his journal, common in isolated communities during times of stress. Recommend increased social interaction and perhaps a town celebration to lift spirits. But mass hysteria didn't explain why his horse refused to approach the Ashbourne property, or why his medical instruments grew cold to the touch whenever he glimpsed the triplets through his cabin window. The doctor's rational explanations crumbled entirely on October 28th, when he was summoned to examine Martha Coldbrook, Phineas's youngest daughter. The 12-year-old had been found that morning in her family's barn, standing motionless among the cattle, her eyes rolled back until only the whites showed. She had been missing for 2 days. Martha couldn't remember where she'd been or how she'd returned. She spoke in fragments about the sisters and the teaching and learning to be quiet like them. Most disturbing of all, she had developed 3 small marks on her left shoulder marks that looked suspiciously like the birthmarks the Ashbourne triplets had carried since birth. Dr. Fairfax examined the marks with a magnifying glass borrowed from Josiah Thornvale's reading kit. Under magnification, what appeared to be simple bruising revealed itself as something far more deliberate. 3 interlocking circles carved into the child's flesh, with surgical precision, the wounds already beginning to heal in a pattern that would leave permanent scars. These marks, the doctor wrote to his colleague in Charleston, appear to have been made with intimate knowledge of human anatomy. The depth and placement suggest medical training, or at minimum, extensive practice on living subjects. Martha Coldbrook had been marked, claimed, inducted into something the adults couldn't understand but felt in their bones. And if one child could be taken, taught, changed, then others could follow. How many children would the triplets need before their true purpose revealed itself? As November's chill settled over Bramble Holler and the first snows dusted the ridgelines, the settlement would discover that Essie, Bessie, and Dessie Ashbourne had been preparing for something far more ambitious than simple intimidation. They had been building an army, one child at a time, and their 18th birthday would mark not just their coming of age, but the beginning of a harvest that would leave the mountains scarred for generations. Martha Coldbrook hadn't spoken a word in 3 days, but her silence carried weight that pressed against every conversation in Bramble Holler, like storm clouds gathering over the ridge. The metallic taste of winter air mixed with something else, something that made mothers pull their children closer when the wind shifted from the direction of the Ashbourne cabin. The community now faced a truth more terrifying than any mountain legend. Their children were disappearing piece by piece, claimed not by death, but by something far more insidious. November brought early snow that year, blanketing the holler in a white so pure it made the dark windows of abandoned cabins look like hollow eye sockets. 3 more families had packed their belongings and headed down to the valley settlements, claiming business elsewhere, but leaving behind livestock, furniture, and decades of mountain roots. Those who remained did so, either from stubborn pride or because they understood something the departed didn't. Running wouldn't help when the danger lived inside their children's dreams. Dr. Fairfax had established a makeshift clinic in the settlement's one-room schoolhouse, treating what he could only describe in his reports as collective nervous exhaustion with unexplained physical manifestations. 7 children now bore the 3 interlocking circles on their left shoulders. Each marking had appeared under different circumstances, but the pattern remained consistent. The child would vanish for a day or 2, return with no memory of their absence, and display a new quiet that echoed the Ashbourne triplets' unsettling stillness. From a medical standpoint, Dr. Fairfax wrote to his mentor at Johns Hopkins, "I'm observing what appears to be induced catatonia in minors, accompanied by deliberate scarification using techniques that suggest anatomical knowledge beyond what one would expect in a rural population." What the doctor couldn't bring himself to document was how the marked children had begun gathering at the edge of the woods each evening, standing motionless until their frantic parents dragged them home, or how they'd started moving in synchronization, like dancers following music only they could hear. The marks were spreading. 10-year-old Samuel Thornvale, the preacher's grandson, disappeared on November 8th while collecting firewood behind his family's cabin. His grandmother found him 2 days later, sitting in the church pew where the Ashbourne triplets usually sat. 3 fresh wounds healing on his shoulder, his young face bearing an expression of adult calculation that made her weep. 8-year-old Rebecca Wesley vanished from her bed on November 13th. Marcella, her grandmother, searched for 36 hours before discovering the child standing waist-deep in the creek behind the Ashbourne property, her nightgown frozen to her skin, but her body warm to the touch. The marks were already there, already healing, already binding her to whatever covenant the triplets were building. Each disappearance followed the same pattern. Each return brought the same changes. Each marking added another voice to the silent chorus that had begun gathering at the settlement's edges, watching, waiting, learning. "They're building something with our children." Mortimer Ashbourne had aged 20 years in the past month, his hands shaking so badly that he could barely grip his morning coffee cup. Helena had taken to her bed, claiming illness but really hiding from the looks her neighbors gave her when she ventured outside. Neither parent seemed capable of controlling their daughters, if control had ever been possible. The triplets moved through the settlement like owners surveying their property, untouchable, unafraid, growing stronger with each child they claimed. Phineas Coldbrook organized the first community meeting on November 16th, gathering the remaining families in the schoolhouse after Dr. Fairfax had finished his evening rounds. 23 adults crowded into space, meant for half that number, their breath fogging in the unheated room, while oil lamps cast dancing shadows on walls lined with children's drawings, innocent scenes of mountain life that now seemed to mock the darkness, pressing in from all sides. "We know what's happening," Phineas said without preamble. "Question is, what are we going to do about it?" Josiah Thornvale stood slowly, his preacher's training warring with his grandfather's terror. "My Samuel won't speak to me anymore, won't look at me. Sits at the supper table like he's listening to voices I can't hear. That ain't my grandson anymore. That's something wearing his face." Murmurs of agreement rippled through the gathering. Other parents shared similar observations. Children who no longer played, who no longer laughed, who watched their own families with the detached interest of scientists studying specimens. The marked children still responded to direct commands, still ate when fed, still slept in their own beds. But the essential spark that made them human seemed dimmed, redirected toward purposes their parents couldn't fathom. "We could leave," suggested Mary Coldbrook, though her voice carried no conviction. "Pack up what we can, start fresh, somewhere else." "And go where?" Phineas replied. "You think whatever's claimed our children won't follow? You think distance matters to something that can reach into dreams?" Dr. Fairfax cleared his throat, drawing attention to the corner where he'd been taking notes. "I've been corresponding with colleagues about similar cases. There are documented instances of mass hysteria, shared delusions, even epidemic psychosis in isolated communities. But the physical evidence, the scarring, the synchronized behaviors, the apparent hypnotic states, these suggest something beyond conventional psychological explanations." The adults stared at him, hungry for rational answers that might make sense of their children's transformation. The doctor continued, his clinical voice wavering slightly. "I believe we're dealing with individuals who have developed sophisticated techniques for psychological manipulation, possibly learned from traveling mesmerists or medical practitioners. The Ashbourne girls may have acquired knowledge of anatomy, pharmacology, even primitive surgical procedures through sources we haven't identified." "You're saying they're just clever?" Marcella Wesley asked, hope creeping into her voice. "I'm saying they're human," Dr. Fairfax replied, "which means they can be stopped." But even as he spoke the words, the doctor remembered his horse's terror, his instruments growing cold, the dreams that had begun visiting him each night, dreams of 3 figures standing at the foot of his bed, beckoning him to join their silent congregation. Rational explanations felt thin as mountain air when confronted with the reality of what the triplets had become. Outside the schoolhouse, snow began falling harder, and those gathered inside couldn't shake the feeling that they were being watched. Through frost-covered windows, shadows moved at the tree line. Small shadows, child-sized, standing perfectly still despite the bitter wind. The marked children had come to listen. What would the adults decide? And would their decision matter when their own offspring had already chosen sides? As November wore toward its end, and the triplets' 18th birthday approached like a deadline written in blood and silence, Bramble Holler would learn that some battles are lost before they begin, especially when the enemy wears the faces of the children you're trying to save. The children stopped coming home on November 23rd, but their parents could still see them standing in perfect formation at the tree line, 13 small figures arranged like chess pieces, waiting for a game to begin. The sound of their synchronized breathing created a rhythm that seemed to match the mountain's own heartbeat, while the scent of pine pitch and something metallic drifted through the settlement on each evening breeze. The battle for Bramble Holler's soul had moved beyond individual families. This was now a war between those who would act and those who had already lost the will to fight. Dr. Fairfax documented the mass exodus in his clinical notes. November 23rd, 1853. 13 minors, ages 8-14, failed to return to their respective homes following what parents describe as evening walks. Subjects were observed maintaining vigil positions approximately 200 yards northeast of Settlement Center, showing no response to parental calls or attempts at physical retrieval. What the doctor couldn't capture in his precise medical language was the heartbreak of watching Mary Coldbrook collapse in the snow after her son Thomas turned his back on her outstretched arms, choosing instead to rejoin the silent congregation of marked children, or the way Josiah Thornvale's voice cracked when his grandson Samuel looked through him as if he were invisible, already belonging to something larger than family, larger than love. The triplets had claimed their army. Now they were preparing for war. Phineas Coldbrook had reached the end of his patience and his faith in reasonable solutions. On November 24th, he strapped on his father's old Navy Colt and walked across the settlement toward the Ashbourne cabin, his boots crunching through snow that had fallen continuously for 3 days. Behind him, 6 other men followed the remnants of the community's fighting spirit, armed with rifles, revolvers, and a determination born from desperation. "This ends tonight," Phineas muttered to himself as they approached the cabin. Through the frosted windows, they could see the triplets seated around their kitchen table, hands folded, motionless as carved statues. The girls didn't acknowledge the armed men surrounding their home. They didn't even blink. Mortimer Ashbourne met the group at his front door, his face gaunt with exhaustion, and something deeper, a recognition that his daughters had moved beyond his ability to understand or control. "Phineas," he said quietly, "you know I can't let you hurt them. They're still my children." "Are they?" Phineas replied, his hand resting on his pistol grip. "Because the children I knew didn't steal other people's young ones and turn them into walking ghosts." The confrontation that followed would haunt the survivors' memories for decades. Helena Ashbourne emerged from the cabin's interior, moving with the unsteady gait of someone who had discovered laudanum's numbing embrace. Behind her came the triplets, dressed identically in dark wool coats, their expressions as calm as Sunday morning churchgoers. "Good evening, Mr. Coldbrook," Essie said, her voice carrying clearly in the cold air. It was the first time most of the men had heard any of the triplets speak in years. "We've been expecting you." "Have you now?" Phineas replied, his grip tightening on his weapon. "Then you know why we're here." "You're here because you've lost something," Bessie continued, her words flowing seamlessly from her sisters. "And you think taking us will bring it back. But what you've lost can't be returned." Dessie finished, her smile containing no warmth, only recognition of a game played to its inevitable conclusion, because it was never truly yours to begin with. The men raised their weapons, but something in the triplets' synchronized response made them hesitate. The girls began humming that same melody that had drifted through the holler for months, and the sound seemed to come from everywhere at once. From the cabin walls, from the snow-laden trees, from the children standing at the forest's edge. Thunder in November mountains. Dr. Fairfax, who had joined the group despite his medical training's emphasis on healing rather than harm, felt his rifle grow impossibly heavy in his hands. The humming wasn't just sound, it was something that bypassed the ears and worked directly on the nervous system, creating a paralysis that spread from fingertips to shoulders to the very muscles that controlled breathing. "The thing about children," Essie said, stepping closer to the frozen men, "is that they trust so completely. They believe what they're told. They follow where they're led. Adults are more difficult," Bessie added, circling to the left like a predator testing prey. "Adults question. Adults resist. Adults think they know better. But in the end," Dessie concluded, moving to complete the triangle around the paralyzed men, "everyone learns to be quiet." The humming intensified, and Phineas Coldbrook, veteran of 2 wars, survivor of mountain winters that had killed stronger men, felt tears streaming down his frozen cheeks as his own grandson stepped from the tree line and began walking toward the cabin. Thomas moved with the same eerie grace as the triplets, his young face empty of recognition, empty of love, empty of everything that had once made him human. What the men discovered that night was that some battles are fought not with weapons, but with will, and the triplets' will had been honed by 18 years of patient preparation. The humming continued until dawn, when 7 grown men were found kneeling in the snow around the Ashbourne cabin, their weapons cast aside, their eyes reflecting the same vacant stare that marked their children. Dr. Fairfax's final journal entry, written in handwriting that grew increasingly erratic, recorded the event with clinical precision, even as his sanity frayed. The subjects demonstrate an ability to induce temporary cataleptic states through auditory stimulation, combined with what can only be described as mass hypnosis. The mechanism remains unclear, but the results are undeniable. The triplets had won without raising a hand in violence. They had turned the community's defenders into another set of marked followers, adding adult voices to their silent congregation. Bramble Holler now belonged to Essie, Bessie, and Dessie Ashbourne, and their 18th birthday, still 5 days away, would mark not just their legal independence, but their full flowering into something the mountains had never seen before. What happens when 3 sisters, who have spent 18 years learning to command silence, finally decide to break it? The answer would come with the December moon, when the triplets would speak their true names aloud for the first time and transform Bramble Holler into something that would make travelers change course for generations, assuming anyone survived to tell the tale. December first arrived with a silence so complete that even the mountain wind seemed to hold its breath, while the scent of wood smoke and something sweeter, something that reminded the few remaining adults of childhood birthday cakes, drifted from the Ashbourne cabin, where preparations had been underway for days. The triplets' 18th birthday would mark more than their passage into adulthood. It would complete a transformation that had been 18 years in the making. Helena Ashbourne had emerged from her laudanum haze 3 days before her daughter's birthday, moving through her cabin with a purpose that hadn't been seen since the girls were small. She baked bread, swept floors, and arranged wildflowers in mason jars with the mechanical precision of someone following instructions only she could hear. Mortimer watched his wife's sudden activity with growing unease, recognizing the glassy-eyed compliance that had claimed everyone else in the settlement. The Mark children, now numbering 21, had taken up residence in the abandoned schoolhouse, sleeping on the floor in precise rows, sharing meals that appeared from unknown sources, and spending their days in silent contemplation that made the building feel more like a monastery than a place of learning. Dr. Fairfax's medical equipment lay scattered and forgotten in one corner, abandoned after his own marking 3 days earlier. His final coherent journal entry read simply, "The subjects have evolved beyond my ability to study them. I fear I am now the subject being studied." Phineas Colebrook and the other adult men who had attempted to confront the triplets now served as a kind of honor guard, standing motionless at the cabin's perimeter, regardless of weather or time of day. Their families had stopped trying to reach them after the first week, understanding that the bodies might remain, but the souls had been conscripted into something larger than individual will. Only 5 adults remained unmarked in Bramble Holler. Marcella Wesley, whose advanced age seemed to provide some protection, Josiah Thornvale, whose faith burned too bright to extinguish easily, Mary Colebrook, whose maternal fury had proven stronger than fear, and Helena's sister Ruth, who had arrived from the next holler just days before the birthday and hadn't yet been claimed. The 5th was a traveling merchant named Silas Kane, who had the misfortune to arrive with a wagon full of winter supplies just as the settlement's transformation reached its crescendo. They gathered in secret on December 2nd, meeting in the abandoned church where Josiah's presence still carried enough weight to provide sanctuary. The building felt cold despite the wood stove, and their whispered conversations seemed to echo strangely in the empty pews where marked children had once sat with their families. "Tomorrow," Marcella said without preamble, "something's going to happen. Something final. I can feel it in my bones, the way I feel weather coming." Ruth Bramblecroft nodded, her resemblance to her sister Helena making her presence in the church feel like seeing a ghost. "The girls asked me to bring something from the old country," she said quietly. "From our grandmother's things. A book written in a language I don't recognize, with pictures that made my skin crawl." "What kind of pictures?" Josiah asked, though his voice suggested he didn't want to know. "Instructions," Ruth replied. "Diagrams. Symbols that match the marks on the children's shoulders. Our grandmother called it a teaching book, but she never taught us what it taught." Mary Coldbrook spoke up from the back pew, her voice raw from days of weeping for children who stood within sight but beyond reach. "The merchant here says he's seen this before. In other places, other settlements." All eyes turned to Silas Kane, a weathered man in his 60s who had spent 4 decades traveling mountain communities. His wagon contained everything from medicines to farming tools, and his routes took him through hollows so isolated they didn't appear on any map. He shifted uncomfortably under their attention. "Not exactly this," he said carefully, "but similar. Places where children went quiet, where adults stopped making decisions. Usually happened gradual-like, over years. But the end result," he paused, seeming to search for words that could convey what he'd witnessed. "Let's just say I learned to recognize the signs and avoid communities that showed them." "What happened to those places?" Marcella asked. "They disappeared," Silas replied bluntly. "Not the buildings, not the land, the people. They'd be there one season, gone the next. Sometimes you'd find evidence of what they became, sometimes not, but they stopped being what you'd call human." The church grew colder as his words sank in. Outside, snow had begun falling again, and through the frosted windows, they could see lights burning in every window of the Ashbourne cabin. The birthday celebration had already begun. Whispers in the darkness. Josiah Thornvale stood slowly, his arthritic joints protesting the movement. "I've been thinking about the old stories," he said, "the ones the Cherokee told before they left these mountains. About places where the boundary between worlds grew thin. About spirits that could take human form, live human lives, until they reached maturity." "You're saying the girls aren't human?" Mary asked. "I'm saying maybe they started human but became something else. Or maybe they were always something else, just pretending to be human until they grew strong enough to stop pretending." Ruth reached into her coat and withdrew the book. She'd mentioned a slim volume bound in leather that seemed to shift color in the lamplight. The cover bore symbols that hurt to look at directly, designs that seemed to move when viewed peripherally. "Our grandmother said this came from the old country, from people who understood things the church wouldn't acknowledge. Maybe it can tell us what we're dealing with." Marcella opened the book carefully, her midwife's hand steady despite her fear. The pages were filled with text in multiple languages, some recognizable as Latin, others completely foreign, interspersed with detailed illustrations that made the small group gasp. Diagrams of human anatomy marked with symbols, instructions for procedures that looked medical but felt wrong, and on the final page, a drawing of 3 identical figures standing around what appeared to be an altar, their hands raised toward a full moon. "December 3rd, Marcella read aloud, her voice shaking as she translated the Latin text beneath the drawing. "The night of becoming, when the vessels reach maturity and the true work begins." Tomorrow was December 3rd. The triplets' 18th birthday. Outside the church, they could hear singing now. Not the eerie humming that had characterized the girls' communications for months, but actual words in harmony, though the language wasn't English and the melody made their teeth ache. The marked children and adults had begun gathering around the Ashbourne cabin, forming circles within circles, all facing inward toward where 3 sisters waited to claim their inheritance. What ancient power had been growing in the bodies of Essie, Bessie, and Dessie Ashbourne? And what would they become when childhood's last restraints fell away? As midnight approached on their 18th birthday, Bramble Holler would discover that some hungers can only be satisfied by consuming everything: the land, the people, and the very boundary between the world of the living and whatever realm had been waiting 18 years for 3 perfect vessels to open the door. The church bell began tolling at 11:47 p.m. on December 2nd, though no human hand had touched the rope, and its bronze voice carried a rhythm that matched no earthly timepiece. 13 strikes, pause, 13 strikes, pause, counting down to something that had no name in any Christian tongue. The sound meant that 18 years of preparation were about to bear their terrible fruit, and the 5 unmarked souls left in Bramble Holler faced a choice between witnessing the transformation or becoming part of it. Marcella Wesley clutched the ancient book against her chest as she peered through the church's frost-covered window. Outside, the entire population of the settlement had arranged itself in concentric circles around the Ashbourne cabin, their bodies swaying in perfect synchronization despite the bitter wind that whipped snow across the mountainside. Children in the inner ring, adults in the outer, all of them humming that wordless melody that seemed to seep into the very stones of the church foundation. "They're all there," she whispered to the others, huddled behind the wooden pews. "Every soul we've lost, standing like they're waiting for communion." Josiah Thornvale moved to join her at the window, his breath fogging the glass as he studied the scene. The marked people weren't dressed for December. Whether many wore only thin shirts or nightgowns, but none showed signs of cold. Steam rose from their bodies like incense, and their exposed skin glowed with an inner warmth that had nothing to do with human circulation. "Look at their shadows," he said, his voice barely audible above the bell's persistent tolling. The others crowded around the window, squinting through the swirling snow. In the moonlight, each person cast 3 distinct shadows instead of 1 dark silhouettes that moved independently of their owners, reaching toward the cabin with grasping fingers that stretched far beyond what the light source should have allowed. Ruth Bramblecroft opened the ancient book again, her fingers trembling as she turned to a page they hadn't examined closely before. The illustration showed a similar gathering, figures arranged in circles around a central structure, but the shadows in the drawing seemed to move as she watched, flowing like liquid darkness toward whatever ceremony was about to begin. "It's not just their minds," she read from the Latin text beneath the image. "The shadows are vessels, containers. Something's been living in the shadows, growing stronger with each person marked. The truth settled over them like grave dirt." The triplets hadn't just been creating followers, they'd been harvesting shadows, collecting the dark reflections of human souls and feeding them to something that had been waiting in the spaces between light and darkness for 18 years. Every marked person was carrying a passenger. Mary Coldbrook pressed her face against the window, searching the crowd for her son Thomas. She found him in the second ring, his 12-year-old frame standing perfectly still, while his shadow writhed and twisted like a living thing, trying to escape its owner's feet. "What's going to happen to them?" she asked, though her voice carried no hope for a comforting answer. Silas Kane, the merchant who had seen similar horrors in other settlements, spoke from the darkness behind them. In the other places, the people changed. Not all at once, gradual-like. Their shadows got stronger while they got weaker until... He paused, searching for words to describe something that defied description. Until there wasn't much left that you'd call human. The bell tower fell silent at exactly midnight, and in that sudden absence of sound, they could hear something else, a voice speaking words in a language that predated English, predated Latin, predated any tongue that had ever shaped prayers or curses in these mountains. The voice belonged to all 3 triplets at once, harmonized into something that resonated in the listener's bones and made the church's wooden walls creak like ship timbers in a storm. The true names were being spoken. Through the window, they watched as the Ashbourne cabin's front door opened and the triplets emerged, no longer dressed in the simple mountain clothing they'd worn for 18 years. Each sister wore an identical white dress that seemed to glow with its own light, and each carried an object that caught the moonlight, strangely curved knives that looked more like surgical instruments than weapons. But it was their faces that made Marcella gasp and step back from the window. The triplets' features were shifting, becoming more perfect, more symmetrical, more beautiful in a way that hurt to look at directly. Their skin glowed like porcelain heated from within, and their eyes reflected light like mirrors, showing not the familiar brown iris color they'd been born with, but something silver and depthless. "They're not human anymore," Josiah whispered, his faith-trained mind struggling to process what his eyes were seeing. "They never were. They were just incubating, using human forms until they grew strong enough for their real bodies." The triplets raised their curved knives toward the full moon, and every shadow in the settlement began moving independently of its owner. The dark shapes flowed across the snow like oil, converging on the cabin, while the people they belonged to remained motionless, their life force draining away to feed whatever was being born in the December night. Ancient hunger awakened at last. The merchant grabbed Marcella's arm, his weathered face pale with recognition. "We have to leave, right now. Once the shadows finish feeding, once they become whatever they're becoming, there won't be anywhere on this mountain to hide." But even as he spoke, they could see that escape was impossible. The shadows had surrounded the church, rising like a dark tide that pressed against the windows and seeped under the doors. The building's consecrated ground provided only temporary protection against something that had been patient enough to wait 18 years and powerful enough to claim an entire settlement. Outside, the triplets began to change in ways that made the human mind rebel against accepting what it was witnessing. Their white dresses dissolved into something that looked like liquid moonlight, and their bodies stretched upward, growing taller, more angular, more perfect in proportions that followed no earthly geometry. What were Essie, Bessie, and Dessie Ashbourne becoming, and would anyone survive to carry word of their transformation to the world beyond Bramble Holler? As the shadows finished their feast and prepared to birth something that would make the Cherokees' warnings about these mountains seem like gentle bedtime stories, the 5 remaining humans understood that they were witnessing not just a birthday celebration, but the return of something that had been sleeping in the spaces between worlds, waiting for 3 perfect vessels to call it home. The screaming started at 12:07 a.m., but it wasn't coming from human throats. It poured from the shadows themselves as they tore away from their hosts and flowed toward the 3 figures that had once been the Ashbourne triplets. The metallic scent of copper filled the air, while the snow beneath the marked people's feet turned black as their life force drained away to feed something that should never have been allowed to wake. This was the moment 18 years of patient cultivation reached its harvest, and Bramble Holler learned what it meant to serve as an incubation chamber for entities that existed in the spaces between worlds. Marcella Wesley pressed her back against the church's far wall, the ancient book clutched so tightly against her chest that its leather binding left marks on her palms. Through the windows, she watched as the triplets shed the last pretense of humanity, their bodies stretching and contorting into forms that followed no earthly anatomy. Where Essie, Bessie, and Dessie had stood moments before, 3 towering figures now commanded the settlement, beautiful in the way that avalanches and lightning strikes were beautiful, terrible in their perfection. "They're not sisters," Ruth Bramblecroft whispered, her voice barely audible above the shadow screams that echoed through the night. "They're aspects, 3 parts of something that was never meant to exist in our world." The truth clicked into place with the weight of falling stones. The triplets hadn't been born as separate individuals. They were fragments of a single consciousness that had needed human vessels to anchor itself in physical reality. Helena's triple birth hadn't been a blessing or curse, but a summoning, a calling forth of something that required 3 bodies to contain its full presence. Silas Kane pulled Mary Coldbrook away from the window as one of the transformed beings turned its mirror-bright gaze toward the church. "Don't let them see you," he hissed. In the other places, Once they finished changing, they could sense thoughts, memories, everything that made people individual. That's when the real hunting began. But it was too late for hiding. The entity that had worn Essie's face for 18 years fixed its attention on the church, and suddenly the wooden walls seemed as transparent as glass. The 5 remaining humans felt their minds laid bare, their memories rifled through like pages in a book, their deepest fears cataloged and filed away for future use. The thing spoke, and its voice came from inside their heads rather than through their ears. You witnessed the awakening. You carry knowledge of what we have become. This makes you valuable. Or dangerous, added the consciousness that had been Bessie, its mental touch cold as winter graves. The choice is yours to make, concluded the third aspect, its thoughts slithering through their minds like snakes made of ice. Outside, the marked people began collapsing one by one as their shadows completed their journey to the transformed triplets. Children crumpled first, their smaller life forces completely drained, followed by the adults whose bodies had sustained the parasitic shadows for weeks. Within minutes, the snow around the cabin was littered with empty shells. Not corpses, exactly, but husks that had been hollowed out so completely that even death seemed too generous a word for their condition. 27 people reduced to nothing more than discarded containers. Josiah Thornvale found his voice somewhere in the depths of his terror, his preacher's training asserting itself even as his faith crumbled around him. "What do you want from us?" he called out, his words echoing in the suddenly silent church. The answer came not in words, but in images projected directly into their minds. Visions of other settlements, other communities that had served as feeding grounds for entities like these. They saw towns where the children vanished first, then the adults, leaving behind empty buildings and stories that no one would ever fully believe. They witnessed the systematic harvesting of human consciousness, the careful cultivation of fear and despair that made souls easier to digest. But they also saw something else: witnesses, survivors, people who had escaped to carry warnings to other communities. The entities didn't just feed on human life force. They fed on the fear and preparation that their reputation generated. Every story told, every warning whispered, every family that packed their belongings and fled at the first sign of strange happenings, all of it served to season the next harvest. Terror has its own flavor. Mary Coldbrook broke away from the group and pressed her face against the window, searching desperately for any sign that her son Thomas might have survived the draining. But the small body lying motionless in the snow bore no resemblance to the laughing child who had chased fireflies just months before. Whatever had made Thomas human had been consumed, leaving behind only the physical shell that had once contained his soul. "They're going to let us live," she said, her voice flat with realization. "Not out of mercy, but because our fear feeds them. Because every story we tell will make the next settlement easier to claim." Silas Kane nodded grimly, his decades of travel suddenly making terrible sense. Every place I've avoided, every community that disappeared there, were always a few survivors. Always someone left to spread the word, to plant the seeds of fear in fertile ground. The merchant pulled a small leather journal from his coat pocket, its pages filled with notes about settlements he'd encountered over the years. "Look at the pattern," he said, spreading the pages across a church pew. "It's not random. They move in cycles, following routes that take them through isolated communities every 18 to 20 years. Long enough for people to forget the details, remember only the warnings." Marcella studied the journal entries, her midwife's practical mind working through the implications even as her heart broke for the children she'd helped bring into the world. "The Cherokee knew," she said finally. "That's why they left these mountains. Not because of white settlers, but because of things like this. They recognized the signs and got their people to safety." Outside, the 3 aspects had begun moving among the empty husks, their impossible forms bending and flowing as they gathered what remained of their harvest. But they weren't finished with Bramble Holler. Not yet. The transformation had awakened something in the mountain itself, a resonance that would draw other entities, other hungry things that had been sleeping in the deep places of the earth. "You will leave before dawn," the collective consciousness informed them, its mental voice carrying the weight of absolute authority. "You will tell what you have seen. You will prepare the next harvest." "And if we refuse?" Josiah asked, though his voice carried no defiance, only exhausted resignation. The answer came in the form of a single image: Ruth Bramblecroft's body joining the empty husks in the snow, her life force drained away as casually as snuffing a candle. What choice did they have when refusal meant death, but compliance meant condemning other families to the same fate that had claimed Bramble Holler? As dawn approached and the transformed triplets prepared to begin their next migration, the 5 survivors would face a decision that would haunt them for whatever remained of their lives: carry the warning that might save others, or take the secret to their graves and let the cycle continue unbroken. Dawn came gray and lifeless over Bramble Holler, revealing a landscape transformed into something that belonged in no earthly geography. The snow had turned the color of bone, dust. The trees stood leafless despite December's early arrival, and 27 empty shells lay scattered around a cabin that now seemed to exist slightly out of phase with reality. The metallic taste of drained life lingered in the air, like the aftermath of lightning, while absolute silence pressed against the survivors' ears with the weight of a grave. The 5 witnesses faced a choice that would define not only their own futures, but the fate of countless families who had never heard of Essie, Bessie, and Dessie Ashbourne. Marcella Wesley stood in the church doorway, clutching the ancient book that had revealed too much truth too late. The transformed entities were gone, departed sometime before sunrise to begin their migration to whatever community would serve as their next harvest ground. But their presence lingered in the mountain itself, a resonance that made every step feel like walking on the bones of the dead. "We could burn it all," Mary Colebrook said, her voice hollow as she stared at the husks that had once been neighbors, friends, her own son. "Burn the cabin. Burn the bodies. Burn every trace of what happened here. Let the mountain reclaim it, and never speak of this night again." Silas Kane shook his head, his merchant's practical mind working through scenarios that all led to the same conclusion. Others will come. Travelers, surveyors, maybe families looking for cheap land. They'll find the ruins, ask questions, start piecing together stories, and without the warning, without knowing what to watch for, he didn't need to finish the thought. They all understood that silence would only ensure more harvests, more empty settlements, more parents watching their children transform into vessels for something that should never have existed. Josiah Thornvale removed his clerical collar and let it fall into the snow, a gesture that felt like shedding the last remnant of his faith. 37 years I've been preaching about good and evil, about God's plan and the devil's temptations. But this, he gestured toward the cabin where 3 beings had shed human form to reveal their true nature. This is something else entirely, something that makes our theology look like children's stories. Ruth Bramblecroft opened the ancient book one final time, studying the illustrations that had prepared them for what they'd witnessed. "Our grandmother knew," she said quietly. "Her grandmother before her. These things have been moving through the world for centuries, maybe longer." The book isn't just a record, it's a warning system, passed down through generations of people who understood that some knowledge is too dangerous to forget. They made their decision in the growing light of December 4th, 1853, as they gathered what few belongings they could carry and prepared to leave Bramble Holler forever. The choice was unanimous, though it felt like volunteering for damnation. They would carry the warning forward, knowing that every story they told would season the fear that made future harvests more efficient. But they would also carry hope, the knowledge that recognition could lead to resistance, that communities warned in advance might have a chance to save themselves. The burden of truth outweighed the guilt of complicity. Over the following decades, the survivors scattered across the eastern mountains, each carrying their portion of the warning to isolated communities that still remembered how to listen to stories their grandparents would have recognized. Marcella returned to her midwifery, but now she watched newborns with different eyes, alert for signs that some births might be summonings rather than blessings. Mary Coldbrook moved to Tennessee, where she established a network of mountain women who passed warnings about silent children and marked families through quilting circles and church gatherings. Josiah Thornvale abandoned formal ministry, but continued preaching in a different way, traveling from settlement to settlement with stories about the importance of watching for signs that communities preferred to ignore. Silas Kane modified his merchant routes to include regular visits to isolated hollows, carrying news and warnings along with his trade goods. Ruth Bramblecroft became the keeper of the ancient book, copying its contents and distributing fragments to trusted families throughout the Appalachian Range. Their efforts created a loose network of watchers, families who understood that survival sometimes meant abandoning their homes at the first sign of children who grew too quiet, or adults who stopped asking questions. Over the years, they prevented at least 7 harvests that might have succeeded, communities that packed their belongings and fled when traveling. Merchants brought word of the Silent Sisters moving through their region, but they couldn't save everyone. Some communities ignored the warnings, dismissing them as mountain superstition. Others waited too long to act, already partially claimed by the time they recognized the signs. The entities adapted too, learning from each failed harvest, developing new techniques for identifying and eliminating warning networks before they could spread their message. The cycle continued, but now it moved through a landscape that had been partially inoculated against its influence. The harvest of Bramble Holler had created something the entities hadn't anticipated, a generation of survivors who understood their methods and were willing to sacrifice their own peace of mind to protect others. The price of vigilance. Bramble Holler itself was abandoned for nearly 70 years, the ruins serving as a monument to what happened when communities chose comfort over caution. The state eventually claimed the land for a forestry preserve, and new growth trees covered the foundations where 27 people had lost everything that made them human. But rangers and hikers still report anomalies in that section of the mountains, places where compasses spin wildly, where digital cameras malfunction, where the silence feels too complete and children refuse to play. The entities that wore the faces of the Ashbourne triplets have never been seen again, though reports surface every few decades of communities that empty overnight, leaving behind only confused authorities and stories that never quite make sense in official reports. The network of watchers continues, passed down through families who understand that some responsibilities transcend individual lifespans. What would you do if your community's children started growing quiet? If trusted neighbors began ignoring obvious dangers? If the taste of local meat became too good to question? The survivors of Bramble Holler learned that the hardest choice isn't between good and evil. It's between a comfortable lie and a truth that demands action, between the safety of ignorance and the burden of bearing witness to horrors that most people aren't ready to believe. But believing was never the point. Watching, recognizing, and acting when action might still matter. These were the tools they passed down to generations who would face the same choice they had faced on that December morning when silence felt like complicity and speaking felt like damnation. Local rangers in West Virginia still receive reports of 3 young women seen hiking the mountain trails in identical white dresses, always appearing around December 3rd each year, always asking directions to the next settlement up the valley. We're only scratching the surface. The next case is even darker. Subscribe before it drops.